Buenas noches, mi gente. Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Radio Olin here on KPFA's La Onda Bajita. I'm your host, Xochitl Bernadette Moreno, and this week it is my pleasure, my honor to welcome to the airwaves with us BIGWIND. BIGWIND is a two-spirit member of the Northern Arapaho Nation coming to us from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. Oh, thank you so much for joining us, BIGWIND.
Nakikita na habatan. Good to see you.
It's really a pleasure. I know that you have been traveling far and wide across our great Mother Earth in her defense and standing up to be a good child to our good mother. And so really excited to share with our listeners a little bit about some of your recent travels, and so that you can carry that good word forward. So yes, welcome.
Yeah, totally down to talk about it. Great to be here.
Awesome. So let's begin. For our listeners out there in Radiolandia, who may have heard a little bit about the cops. And this time, we're not talking about the pigs. We're not talking about the ones that be on our back in our streets day in, day out. No. This time, we are talking about the Conference of Parties, and these large multinational gatherings that have been happening to call attention to the crisis that our climate is in, the crisis that we are in as humans living on this earth, and what it is that we could do about it, and how we can try to shift the powers that be to sign into laws, and to really bring into the practice of our lives, of our bodies, of the way that businesses are conducting themselves and the ways that civil society is conducting itself, how to live in a way that will ensure that the future generations will have a healthy world to inherit, and to call their own. So, BIGWIND, if you can, in your words, describe a bit about the Conference of Parties. And before, let me back up and say that I know that you've returned from two different Conference of Parties, from COP27 in Egypt, this larger, kind of big scale gathering, and then another gathering that happened in Montreal, the Conference on Biodiversity. So if you could just speak to what both of these are.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I should take it back. And in 1992, there was an Earth Summit held by the United Nations where it was held in Rio and became monumental. That kind of like the impetus of why we have these conferences today. And what they talked about at that conference before I was even born was that there was climate change happening, loss of biodiversity and desertification happening, and that we needed to create international policy to try to combat both climate change and biodiversity loss. And so if people wanted to pinpoint a time in UN history, they would look back to the Rio principles, they would look back to the Rio summit, as the creation of these two larger summits. And since then, there has been various policies, pacts, procedures that have been passed. Most people who are aware of COP27, which is based around the act of climate action, combating climate change. Its most noteworthy agreement is the Paris Climate Accord and in the Paris Climate Rulebook. And this was finally agreed upon after many failed policies and pacts, to try to have some very straightforward goals. That, there's three goals. One goal being that we're able to stop and curb the climate crisis. And I think it's really important when we're talking about this to understand that both biodiversity loss and climate change are inherently interlinked, but deserve roles and procedures that are working in tandem with each other. And so when we talk about COP15, that is the Conference on Biodiversity, and they meet less regularly than the climate change conference, with the exception of 2020, when we were in the middle of a pandemic. The COP on climate change has met every single year. And the last time that the Conference for Biodiversity met was in 2010. And so it meets every decade. And so we know that these conferences and the results of them kind of lock us into decades worth of rules, policies, and procedures.
Wow. Wow. I mean, just my brain was just trying to fathom that, right? Because we also know the pace of bureaucracy, and how slow it can be from the signing of a law, the signing of a pact, of a treaty, even, right? To then, when we as individuals living in the world actually see the results of those very well-intentioned words coming into effect, actually being in effect. So wow, a decade between those meetings. My goodness. Well, all I can say is that I'm glad to know that people such as yourself were out there. And let's talk for a moment about I want to just actually pause, and if you could speak to our listeners a little bit about the work that you do and some of your background, so they can have some context to understand the kinds of people that are finding themselves in these spaces.
Yeah, I am, like was mentioned earlier, from the Wind River Reservation. And when I was very young, I didn't have the words for it, but I was living and experiencing with people of my tribe environmental racism. I grew up in a community where right behind us is oil and gas fields, and we used to play in the Beaver Creek, which the community was named after, fish in there, swim in there. And we didn't know, I mean, I didn't know until much later that that area was being used by the fossil fuel industry to dilute its waste. And so therefore we were swimming in their pollution much of our childhood. My mom's house, under the house, we are in an area where there is radioactive waste tailings ponds. And so they didn't switch over the water until 1999. It was 5 then. And so to know that these things were happening in my backyard, well, on the south side of the Wind River, but when you look from my mom's house on the north side of the Wind River, you can see mansions, you can see a golf course, lawns. So to see that distinction where there are people who could live in a literal paradise on one side, and how those people who were living in those areas were purposefully putting these projects in areas where they thought were of least concern, of least importance, and that we didn't have the political power to fight against these systems, that really propelled me into action, into movement when I was at the age of 13. And so I grew up in the environmental and youth leadership movements through my entire life, participating in these systems. And I feel like there became a point in time where growing up in these situations, I had played every role within this scope of work, and had been to the regulatory commissions, had been to the public utility commissions, had testified in front of state and other legislatures, and oftentimes I feel like even when we get into policy, it's hard for us to see those results firsthand. And if we do see the results of those policies at all, it happens, like you were saying, much later on, seeing those things. And so I was able to go to Standing Rock, where I spent several months, and that catapulted me into direct action, into seeing, and I think the difference between direct action and other tactics are that you can see those results firsthand, and they can happen nearly immediately, where you want to stop something from happening and you do it yourself, and you can stop something from happening instead of waiting for these people in platinum title roles to make the right decisions. I will say that I am an avid supporter of a diversity of tactics, and I believe that we are more effective when we're not stuck into a silo of using one tactic, but that we're utilizing all tactics to our benefit.
Mm. Oh, thank you so much for those words, BIGWIND. I too am a youth that came up in the direct action anti-globalization movement, and so it warms my heart to hear your perspective and to be able to share that perspective with our listeners. Definitely cut my chops in some similar ways. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Well, so all that to say that that you experienced the effects of industrial society, of capitalism, of the man-made quote unquote systems on our natural world. And then that catapulted you into action and into a place of leadership among your community. And then that's how you found yourself at the COP, really doing this work and engaging in these conversations with others. Can you talk about some of the other delegations that you met? Who were you interacting with, and what was that interaction like? And then I want to hear about some of the actions that you all took and those discussions too. But yeah, who were you with at the COP?
Well, my first introductions to international policy, I actually went to COP25. That was in 2019 held in Madrid, Spain. And at that time, I was a part of an all indigenous delegation from the group called Sustain Us. And Sustain Us has been like the quote unquote unofficial US young people delegation from the ages of 18 to 29 for the past 20 years. And this year, I was able to join Sustain Us again in their delegation. This year was a BIPOC delegation, and so Black, Indigenous people of color from not only the US, we had one delegate from Canada, one delegate from Argentina. And so we were like an international delegation that was advocating on behalf of young people who happen to be from like most affected people in areas.
Mm.
So in that, I feel like it really shows kind of the difference in, there's this part of the COP space where you have party members, and so 190 plus countries have their own negotiation teams, negotiation heads that are able to work within negotiation blocks, that are able to create pacts and then therefore create legislation or international policy. And for a while, when these situations are going on, they allowed fossil fuel lobbyists into these rooms and into these discussions and into these negotiations, while not allowing what we would call now civil society to be able to combat a lot of their rhetoric because they are invested, into these systems. And so it led for an unfair advantage for fossil fuel corporations to be able to be at the table. And as we know, as people who are BIPOC, who are disadvantaged, when we're not at the table, then we're on the menu. Our lands, our communities, and our well-beings are on the menu. And so we have to be there inside those discussions. We have to be there at the table, and we have to be there inside the negotiations to ensure that we can protect our communities. And so through that span, and at COP27 in Egypt, it is important to note that Egypt has been going through a series of uprisings, and that this has allowed that they do not respect freedom of speech, that they don't respect activism, and in fact that can end up with you imprisoned, tortured, and even death. And so there's 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt right now. Over 100 of them are in there for environmental crime, or standing against environmental crimes. And so, and we know that COP28, next year's conference, is going to be in Dubai, which also has similar human rights abuses. But the point of them being in the Middle East right now is to secure oil money for areas that are being affected by climate change. Leading up to this, knowing this, there was overwhelming opposition of having this in Egypt, and there's still overwhelming opposition in holding it in Dubai. But we see this as like a way of window dressing these economies into thinking that they're green, that they that they're able to greenwash a certain part of their how they're seen nationally, while still polluting and still allowing for these policies that hurt us to keep happening. And so I think it's important when we're at these discussions to ensure that our voices are being heard. And how is that happening? There is a part of civil society, there's 8 different constituencies. And so each, like the oil and gas lobbyists, they're in Bingo, which is like the business NGO. Anyone who's under the age of 35 is in Youngo, which is the youth NGO. And then like IPO is the Indigenous Peoples Organization. And so there's various ways that you can plug in. And you going to this area every time you go to your constituency meetings in the morning, they'll tell you what policies, what negotiations need to be watched, what high-level meetings need speakers, ways that we can intervene, and then ways that we can affect policy and change. And so that's how certain people are plugging into this space.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, about how people plug in, because it seems as though, from the outside, like, unless you are, a rock star activist, kind of like on the front lines every day, or a fossil fuel lobbyist, or on some governmental team, that there isn't a place for you at these meetings. But could you talk about ways that civil society can engage with the cops, and what that level of interaction could look like, and how people can affect change in these spaces?
There are 3 ways to be invited to a COP. I think it's something to note that these COP spaces are elitist, that they do have still to this day, fossil fuel lobbyists always outnumber any constituency of the COPs. And since, when we talked about earlier, the Earth Summit that happened in Rio, it has been imperative that not only all constituencies of civil society are participate, but that we are integral to getting our own countries to move the needle. And we can see that even with even with policy like the Paris Climate Accord, even with this post-2020 biodiversity framework, that indigenous people, women, and gender are leading the forefront and are ensuring that we're not leaving anybody out. And the three ways that people are able to get invited to this space are: one, through an NGO, which is a nonprofit that has signed up through the UN. You can join their delegation or be accepted to a delegation, and there are various delegations with various identities, and I think that that's a way that a lot of people from civil society are able to have access to the space. The second way is to get invited by a party. And so, with the United States, with Canada, they have their negotiation team, and then they have party overflow, which means that they are able to get access to badges that allow certain people into the space and into the negotiations. And then the third way is that you get invited by the UN. And that's kind of like the way that I think a lot of people assume people are invited into space, like you were saying, like, a lot of like environmental celebrities and whatnot. And so I think it's interesting. And I think all three different ways allow you different access to the space. And for a long time, I mean, all three of these ways, they are considered observer status. And so people, particularly white people, came to this conference for decades, and they just watched what was happening. They never intervened because they were comfortable. And when you are able to be comfortable in what you live in your current everyday, day to day, you aren't going to stand up against when other people are being left out of the conversation. And it makes you less likely to be able to intervene in these situations. And I think when you allow BIPOC people access to this space, who come from nothing, who have everything to lose, we're just more likely to intervene in those situations and not just watch.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad that you're speaking to this way that our folks can participate, right? And that the way that people are showing up, and showing up not just for themselves, but showing up on behalf of our global community. And I think it just speaks volumes to the ways that BIPOC people are actually doing work on the day-to-day based on the lived experiences of challenge and of hardship. It's like that age-old saying that, it's the person that really only has a couple dollars in their wallet that are gonna give something to those in need on the street when they're asking. And it's like I see this every day in the work that I do here with unhoused people. But I think when you speak to how people can be involved, it also was inspiring me to hear you say that it's about how we can help our governments move the needle in the policies that they're going to push forward, and what is acceptable here. And so it's one thing to sign this, Paris Climate Accord that finally the US signed, right? But then, or to have the goal of being, carbon neutral by 50/50. But it's us as the people living here in this country electing, people into office, and then, being consumers and being just like a part of this system, whether we like it or not. It's up to us to move that needle and to keep folks in power accountable to the decisions that they are making. And so if you could just speak to what some of that looks like for you and for the folks that you organize with.
I think, ensuring that our peoples are at the table, there's various ways that we can plug in. There are a lot of people who, their way that they plug in is they come here and they make art, they make banners, they make all of the signs, living art through the lens to try to ensure that we're bringing that into a very colonial space. I think it's important for people to recognize that. And the way that it was explained to me when I was going into this area is that there are metaphysical beings at war in these spaces, and that you need to really protect yourself, your energy, mentally, physically, spiritually protect yourself. And these areas, they need prayers, they need smudge, but they feed off of our energy. And so if we're not really like feeding ourselves, if we aren't making sure that we're protecting ourselves, then this arena will take advantage of those things. So we do need art, and then we need people who are taking care of the people who are putting themselves in the situation. And so we have artists here, we have healers here, have people who are participating in actions here who find their power in direct actions, and then the people who are focusing on policy and negotiations. And so I see those as various ways that people are stepping in. How I like to call myself a jack of all trades. I like to like get my toes wet in like every single little thing. I don't, I like to dabble in everything. And so I like to see, and I think that we're more effective that way. I know that there are people who they see themselves participating in one way, but they also know that there is somebody who's participating in another way, and that we're creating like this fist that is able to work, in unison. For me, when I went to COP27, I wanted to, my goals were to ensure that I was not only participating in international policy making, but that I was holding the United States accountable. And leading up to the COP, we were in discussions and briefings with the US State Department, and they were giving us kind of the lowdown of how they were going to be navigating the space. And I think that as an Indigenous person, as a person who comes from a most affected community, I was very blunt and blatant about my expectations from the get-go, and who I was as a frontliner. And I feel like a lot of things that could have been conveyed from the US or from the State Department weren't conveyed until we landed in Egypt, and they had pretty much decided that they were just going to perform lip service and not come with real actual solutions. And in fact, we're going to propose and lift up false solutions at this international arena. And so one of the biggest, I guess two of the biggest things that I seen the US doing in this space was, one, they proposed a climate transition accelerator, and John Kerry was at the US Pavilion, which is where most of like the United States events happen, and was on a podium talking about how the US was not going to work with big oil, and how that they were going to essentially create this public-private partnership with PepsiCo and Bezos to ensure that we could incentivize carbon credits. And a lot of people, as from frontline communities and scientists, can say that there is that carbon credits are a false solution. And if you are partnering with the second largest plastic polluter and a company whose whose fossil fuel production is the equivalent to 180 coal-fired power plants, you are working with polluters. And so I think in that moment, we had taken an opportunity to bird dog carry to ensure that they were not going to be able to lie to the world for a world stage without being interrupted in that moment.
Yes, thank you. And I saw the video, and that was really, in that moment, I was so, so proud to call you my relative, and to know that they weren't going to get away with it.
Mhm.
And you know, can you now speak about, yeah, what were some of the agreements that were made? What happened, and how are we going to continue to keep holding these leaders accountable?
Yeah, I would say, I really quick would like to mention after that, we met with John Kerry. They were really surprised to see me in the room. We let them know that we had constructive feedback on a lot of the policies that were being made by the State Department, and including how that they were that the US was really pushing that the Inflation Reduction Act was the largest climate bill in the history of the world, when all of the green money is tied to oil and gas lease sales on public lands. Now 95% of public lands are up for oil and gas lease sales. So to
Can you
know
say
that
that again? Say that again in case our listeners didn't catch that.
95% of public land is up for oil and gas lease sales.
Wow.
And so to know that that this was being greenwashed to be like the largest, like we're making all this movement, and that the United States is like a leader in climate action. And then when Biden came to COP27, he said indigenous people are the solution, while his negotiation team was asking to remove indigenous people from Article 6 of the Paris Climate Accord. And we took that moment to interrupt Biden's speech because we felt that it was imperative to know that he was also not going to come to this forum and perform lip service and then think that he was going to get away with it.
Yeah.
After that happened, we met with the U.S. climate policy advisor, Ali Azid, who gave us the rundown on how they see there's been a that the Biden administration is doing more for climate than the Trump administration, essentially, when in fact there are more oil and gas lease sales now. And so providing this constructive feedback to the White House, I feel like when we went out there, we completed the goals that we were wanting to. One of the biggest things that policy that would have or did make COP27 a success was the loss and damage fund. One thing that I can say for people who do not know about what loss and damage is, it is essentially climate reparations. And so for areas that are experiencing some of the effects of climate change now in present day, need to be able to have access to funds that aren't made from predatory loans, including the IMF. And this money needs to be set up in an account and needs to be funded by countries of the global north. And that was the biggest thing that came out of COP27 that made it successful.
And how do countries who have been affected apply to the loss and damage fund? Like, what does that process look like? And how does it differ from these predatory loans that were set up by, the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund? And can you just talk a little bit about that?
There's a lot of countries right now, and especially countries of island nations, where they are being essentially right now pigeonholed into accepting loans from these other organizations to try to fix a lot of these issues that are happening from climate catastrophe. And so when we look at Pakistan, we look at Cuba, Puerto Rico, who have all faced things in 2023, there isn't a fund right now where they could just be like, hey, we need $100 million, and it's just given over with no intermediators. And I think it shows to seeing what that looks like in the future. One part is done where they've agreed to create this fund, but as it stands, there's no money in this fund right now. And so we need, one baby steps. We've created that step to ensure that this fund is going to be created. And now we need to ensure that Canada, the United States, Europe, what's considered all of the quote unquote the West, is supplementing this fund so that we're not creating this perpetual cycle of harm.
Right. So I guess that sounds to me like a way that civil society can engage again to put pressure on our government to actually put money in the loss and damage fund, and to, actually put their money where their mouth is.
The United States could have came to this summit ensuring that they were going to supply a quarter of this fund, because we are responsible for a quarter of the U.S. The U.S. is responsible for a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions of the world. And that's a way that we could have had a real solution in this, but instead they decided to go with less expensive other solutions that allowed them to greenwash what they were doing.
Well, so that leads me to my next question. And, we've got to wrap up here soon, but it feels imperative that I ask you this. So, we hear this term greenwashing, right? And I was hoping that you could, for our listeners out there, help demystify some of these myths of our green economy, or some of the false solutions that are being touted out there by our politicians that actually don't have teeth, or what is the deal with carbon credits, and if you could maybe talk about what are your top 5 climate myths, and what is greenwashing, and what is it that people can actually know, from someone who's been living this firsthand, such as yourself.
So one of the biggest ploys inside of these international conferences and inside corporations regulations is the word net zero. Net zero allows for corporations and countries to still continue to pollute areas while buying carbon credits from one area and saying that that one area kind of cancels out the other. Scientists will say that carbon credits aren't real, and that the math that's done behind these allows for a lot of discrepancies, including double counting, where the party who has this nature preserve is counting that they have that, and then they're selling off to a company the same amount of carbon credits that allows for both areas to count as this. It's also known in the international arena as nature-based solutions, which sounds really nice, right? That we're going to rely on nature to take care of these problems. But it's a fallacy in itself, and indigenous people will tell you, because it creates what they call fortress conservation. This started in my backyard with the Yellowstone National Forest, where they kicked out the indigenous people, created this myth that nature and that wilderness is separate from man.
Yeah.
They were able to create these areas, and now it's having detrimental effects on populations in Africa and Asia as we speak, where indigenous people are being removed from the land. They create a nature preserve, a state park, a national park, and then be able to count these as credits that companies can essentially buy. And so for us as Indigenous people who are being pushed from land in the name of conservation, we need to be able to stand up to these situations and say, this is not a real solution. A real solution is giving the land back to Indigenous people, as we are 5% of the world's population, yet we are protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. So when we talk about why is it important that Indigenous people are at these conferences, that quote in itself, that fact in itself, is enough to ensure that Indigenous people are a part of the conversation.
Mm, mm, mm. I'm just going to say those again. So that 5%, Indigenous people make up 5% of the world's population, but are taking care of 80% of the world's biodiversity. That just, I think, like, sometimes just hearing the numbers can really do something that perhaps words can't. And I really hope that our Indigenous relatives that are listening to our words right now can also feel a part of this larger work that is happening, and know that relatives across this globe are coming together, and that their lands, their people, are also being considered, and that all of our relatives, you know, be they the ones that are in the houses of government, or be they the lobbyists of these fossil fuel companies themselves, we will all inherit this same earth. And it is imperative that we, as you say, give land back to the rightful stewards, the people that are knowing how to take care of the trees, how to speak to the wildlife, how to pray to the lands, in the words, in the songs, in the ways and messages that those lands can respond back. And so 100% land back.
Yes. And I mean, I think to sum it up, we know as Indigenous people that the loss of biodiversity and climate change were caused by colonialism and capitalism. And so we're not going to fix these solutions with neo-colonialism and capitalism. These solutions are going to come from Indigenous people who have Indigenous ways of knowing and traditional ecological knowledge. And so to ensure biodiversity for our future generations, and to ensure that we can curb climate catastrophe, we need to ensure that traditional ecological knowledge is seen and equated on par with Western climate science.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that we are implementing these things into policy, and that we're not just looking for representation to tokenize Indigenous people, but that our ideals and our technologies are implemented into these plans.
That's right. And I think you brought up this really important element about, it's not just about, okay, protecting nature, putting it in this little reserve and expecting that it's going to, be exactly as it should be forever. No, there has been this intrinsic relationship between human beings and the land and the species. I always hear folks talk about, here on Turtle Island, it wasn't the people that were following the buffalo. The buffalo were following the fire. The buffalo were following, the fire tracks, and there was this intrinsic relationship. It's not just about isolation anymore. It's about all of the interconnected ways. And yes, and it's the cult, I think, of the expert needs to come to an end. Yeah. And traditional technologies 100% have kept us alive for far longer than capitalism has drowned us out. And so I have faith in those technologies, and I have trust in our ways. And it's so good to know that these conversations are alive and well, that you, my relative, are alive and well, that this work is happening. I want to just send a big shout out to my relative Messiah, and the house of people that are protecting our relatives, healing them up, in Montreal. All of the people that are hitting the streets from civil society, all of the folks that have painted a banner, that have gone outside of their comfort zone, that have stood up to the politicians, to the lobbyists, that have, really put their bodies, their communities on the line, and that will continue to do so until we can all live in a healthy world. So thank you, BIGWIND.
Yeah, thank you. It was good to talk about all this.
Yeah. Do you have any final words, or you want to say goodbye to our listeners out there in Radiolandia?
Yeah, I would say one thing I want to give a shout out to the indigenous youth who shut down Trudeau's speech at COP15. And so this is ensuring that these countries who are most responsible for climate change and biodiversity loss will not continue to talk on the world stage as if they are the leaders, and painting themselves that way, when we know that as people who are from these lands, that's a fallacy in itself. And so to see that, Biden and Trudeau were shut down at the World Forum within a month of each other, it ensures, both by indigenous youth, it ensures that we are carrying on that legacy of our ancestors. And so I want to thank you all for listening today. And I want to thank you all for joining us in talking about movement.
Oh, thank you. Yes, my good listeners, that was the voice of BIGWIND, a Two-Spirit tribal member from the Northern Arapaho Nation. Thank you so much, BIGWIND,
Thank you.
for your work, for your time. Thank you, my listeners. I'm your host, Xochitl Bernadette Moreno, with this week's edition of Radio Olin, or Movement Radio, here on KPFA's La Onda Bajita. Oh.